Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz here with another episode of Dave's Faves. And today I'm going to be talking about Beethoven's Late Quartets, but not the usual Beethoven's Late Quartets. I'm talking about this, as arranged for string orchestra, all of the Late Quartets by Terje Tonnesen and the Camerata Nordica on Bis. This is one of the great recordings in the history of recordedom. First of all, the performances are just amazing, fabulously well played. But second of all, I think they do wonderful things for this music. I really do. Beethoven's late quartets are difficult works. They're difficult works by reputation. They're not so difficult, I think, once you understand what Beethoven is trying to do. And what Beethoven is trying to do, I want to talk about that a little bit. It really deserves a whole, much longer exordium, which at some point perhaps I will be able to embark upon, the whole late Beethoven style. But what Beethoven is doing in his late period has as much to do with the language of music and what it can do as it does immediacy of expression. And the two are not incompatible, because what Beethoven was trying to do was enhance the immediacy of expression by expanding the language of what music could do stylistically. And by that, I mean something very simple. I know that sounds very, bullshitty, frankly, and I don't want to play into the Beethoven myth, that these pieces are so transcendental, and so they're not transcendental. I mean, maybe they are. If you feel like they are, then they are. But what I mean is they're extremely immediately expressive, but they're not easy. And the reason they're not easy is because the range of expression is so wide and the means of expression is so varied. And that can make them a little bit difficult. But when we come down to it, when it all boils down to the basics, what Beethoven is doing is exploiting and recombining two basic types of musical expression. There is the sonata dramatic expression that he was sort of born with and that he developed to its, then highest peak. And that sonata dramatic expression is one in which things happen to tunes. The tunes are characters. They're characters in an ongoing musical drama, a narrative, and they evolve and change over time. And there are events and things happen, and there's action and reaction. That's what sonata form does, and it's all harmonically driven. It's driven by key, by the tonality of the melody that occupies a certain space, and the melody changes its character as that space changes. In other words, we journey through a continuum of different keys and tonalities, which are locations in music, and in each location there's an event, and you can think about it a million different ways. But essentially, what happens is a way to think about it is that themes are characters, and as characters, they will undergo change and development. That's the sonata style. Opposed to that, which are not opposites, they're just different, is the rhetorical style, the baroque style, if you want to call it that, because that's what baroque music was. That's the style based on, more or less, for the most part, on counterpoint. Because counterpoint, which is multiple musical lines happening simultaneously, is not linearly progressive. It's monolithic. It builds structures up. And the effect of this kind of stylized music, the style or aesthetic of music, the Baroque style, is rhetorical. It's not dramatic. That doesn't mean it isn't moving. They're both moving. You can go see a play that has you crying at the end. You can listen to read a poem, or listen to an incredibly moving speech or a sermon and be crying at the end. It can be intensely powerful and moving. It's just that the means of getting there is different. And so what Beethoven is doing is he's combining the two means of expression in different ways, and mostly in separate movements throughout a work, to see, what he can do to create these uber expressive big statements. And that's what these late string quartets have. He did it in the Hammerklavier Sonata, which I just talked about in the previous Dave's Faves. And he does it in all of his large-scale works, from about the mid-18 teens onward. That's where he's going. And it's a fascinating thing to observe. And once you understand what it is, then I think it's really quite a bit simpler because you need to know what the forms are for each of these styles. The forms of sonata music, obviously, are sonata form, which I've talked about ad nauseum. And there's a video where I unpick sonata form. For those of you who really don't know what it is, I suggest you look at my music chat on sonata form. I think it will give you some easy access to the concept. But the Baroque forms are equally well defined. They are essentially fugue, which is you know what a fugue is. Bach wrote billions of them. It's where you have a subject and it's discussed in a certain number of voices, one after the other, and they build up a large scale work by repeating the same subject at various times with interludes that give you some variety and some change of pace before the subject returns. And there are all kinds of ways to treat the subject. You can play it right side up or upside down or backwards or in longer notes or shorter notes, and all of those things wind up building a large and imposing piece, usually called a fugue. So there's the contrapuntal aspect, and there are lots of other contrapuntal devices, but that's the big form of Baroque contrapuntal or rhetorical music. It's a bunch of people all talking about the same thing and making it expressive by virtue of their collective hammering home and the slants they give on that thing. And there's also theme and variations. Variation movements lie somewhere in the middle between the two forms because they can be somewhat sonata oriented, that is organized by harmonies and they of course all use thematic transformation, but they're also quite sectional because you have distinct individual variations, all of which are supposed to be variations on one idea. So they have a place in the Baroque style and a place in the sonata style, in the rhetorical style and the dramatic style. And then in the middle, there are all these dance pieces and smaller forms, which can be part of anything. They can do it. They can do absolutely anything. There are scherzos, there are minuets, there are other kinds of slow movements, song style movements, and simple A-B-A forms. All of these things are common to both. So the best way to understand this, I think, is to look at Beethoven's 14th string quartet. That's in C sharp minor, which is a very interesting key. We've done some talks about the emotional meaning of keys. Well, who cares? This is a fabulous quartet because it begins with a fugue, a slow fugue, a very moving movement, which is an adagio non troppo, but molto espressivo, as Beethoven is always saying in these late works. He's always urging his players to greater and higher and more powerfully intense expression. And it ends with an allegro in sonata form, a sonata movement, a dramatic movement that summarizes the whole quartet. Then smack dab in the middle of it, and has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 movements. 7 movements, a lot of different pieces put together. Right in the middle is a big, long, 13 minutes in this case, variation movement, a slow movement in variation form, which has lots of different tempo changes and changes of mood. It's a very highly varied movement, beautiful, beautiful movement. And then in between those, you have 2 scherzos. The scherzos are really fun. That means they're dance pieces, breezy pieces, joking pieces of a characteristic style. And then there are these little connecty movements after each scherzo. The whole quartet gets played virtually as a single movement, without pauses between them. And those are allegro moderato and adagio. It's only 51 seconds long. And then an adagio, which is 2 minutes long and serves as an introduction to the finale. And those really, really short movements are sometimes, in some ways, the most interesting of all because those are the ones that ask the question, where are we going? And how are we going to do this? Or what's going to happen next? That's their purpose. Their purpose is to serve as transitions by reacting to what we've just heard and anticipating what we're about to hear. So I think this particular quartet, number 14 in C sharp minor, which has an opus number, opus 131, in case you're curious, is a wonderful way of coming to grips with what Beethoven is trying to do in all of these works. And each quartet does it differently. Because like the next one, number 13, oh, that's the one that ends with the grosse fuga. It ends with the fugue, which is really a trip, let me tell you. It was so difficult and complicated in Beethoven's day that he detached it and made it a separate piece, although here it's played in the context of the entire quartet, which I think it should be, quite frankly, because that highlights that aspect, that dual aspect of Beethoven's writing. Now, one of the reasons I particularly love this particular box is not just are the arrangements fabulous and the whole thing extraordinary, but Beethoven's last quartets were composed almost in a way, almost in an objective way as to the medium. It's not that they're not string music, they are, and it's not that they're not fabulously conceived for the quartet, they are, but the wider musical concept can just as readily be expressed with larger forces. And some people, and was one of them for many, many, many years, had a very difficult time coming to grips with the sheer length of these works as heard in the quartet medium. They seem to me to ask for just more impact, larger forces, something. You know, the quartet sound can be very monochromatic in large doses. And with time, I came to appreciate what they were, especially hearing great performances by great quartets. I mean, it's not like they're going to be necessarily boring. You have to begin to appreciate what the medium can do. But just as readily, it's wonderful to hear them in a different setting, which achieves much more easily these big contrasts of loud and soft and density of texture than a quartet can. It just goes without saying. One of the reasons Beethoven was writing for quartet in those days was because he could never have achieved the subtlety of nuance and variety of tempo and expression and accent with an orchestra, because orchestras in those days were big, clumsy things. You could expect maybe one rehearsal before you had a concert, and God knows what would happen when you actually did it. And Beethoven was deaf, and all of those things, I think, sort of came together in determining that he would write for the quartet as the most flexible instrumental medium at his disposal, and expressive, because they were strings. He couldn't quite achieve the same volume and intensity of expression just writing, for example, piano sonatas, even though he tried in his last 3 or 4 piano sonatas. He got very, very close. But strings as the most obviously emotional, vocal, intensely expressive instruments were the natural medium for what Beethoven was trying to do at that time. Today, on the other hand, we have string ensembles which are so flexible, so capable of doing all of the things that Beethoven intended, and really all of the things that a string quartet can do, basically. I know some people will say, no, you can't achieve the same intimacy and what did I know. String quartets are still wonderful. They still do things that larger forces can't do in terms of subtle nuance. But, there's a question of just how much subtlety of nuance Beethoven was really after in a day when subtlety was not exactly de rigueur in the way one performed. Certainly today's ensembles can achieve a subtlety of nuance quite similar to anything that anyone in Beethoven's day could have done, and they sure as hell do it here. I mean, the proof is just in the listening. Either they do it or they don't do it. That's what it boils down to. And the Camerata Nordica does it. And they do it fabulously. And so I really think that as a way to get into Beethoven's late quartets and his late musical language in general, in a way that really sugars the pill a little bit, and there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with that at all. This is a fabulous way to do it. And I love these performances. I listen to them all the time, and my enjoyment of them only has grown over the years. It really has. So this is a very strong recommendation. And if I want to hear a late Beethoven quartet, I am just as likely to listen to these string orchestra versions as I am the regular quartet versions. And the fact that they're written for string orchestra, I hasten to say, does not mean that everyone's playing all the time. There are many, many moments where they preserve Beethoven's quartet textures to achieve that necessary degree of intimacy. It doesn't mean you have to give up all of the nuance of the smaller ensemble. You just get more bang for your buck. So keep on listening, friends. Thank you so much for joining me. Take care.